Okie dokie. Good to see you all. Today I'm going to open class by talking about this beautiful black woman, the servant of God. See a picture of her here. The servant of God, Julia Greeley. Julia Greeley was born around 1833. Where do I put that there? Anyways, born around 1833. We don't know her exact date of birth or the year that she was born in, and she died in 1918. As you can already see from the information here, she was a former slave. She was born in the slave state of Missouri, slave state at the time. And she was called, her nickname was One-Eyed Julia, Ms. Civarelli. How did she get that nickname? Because her slave master injured her right eye while whipping her mother. Apparently he was beating her mother at the time, and Julia got in the way and hit her right eye, and it destroyed her right eye. So I guess she didn't have vision in her right eye. So she was known as One-Eyed Julia. In 1879 or thereabouts, not totally sure, so I'll put a question mark, 1879, her family moved from Missouri to, well, at the time what was called the Colorado Territory. Now it's the modern day state of Colorado, but at the time it was just a territory. And she worked there as a cook and a nanny. And there she is holding a child. Okay, so she took care of the children of the parents. She was not raised as a Catholic, but in 1880 she converted to the Catholic Church and became a Catholic and was baptized as a Catholic, so apparently she wasn't even baptized yet, but that happened in 1880. She suffered from arthritis, but she would walk the streets of Denver giving out Catholic literature. So apparently once she converted, she became very much fervent in her faith. She would pull a wagon around, even though she was arthritic, she would pull a wagon around the city to distribute food, coal for fuel, because of course it snows in Denver, clothing to poor families, and so she came to be called the Colored Angel of Charity in the language of the day. We wouldn't call her that nowadays. We would call her an angel. I guess we call her an angel of color today. Sounds to me like saying the same thing as colored, which used to be offensive, but whatever. Okay, that's what we say today. But she was called the Colored Angel of Charity for her charity work amongst poor people. She did this work at night, typically at nighttime. Why? Because she did not want to embarrass white people for receiving help from a black woman. So she had to deal with racist overtones there. Nevertheless, she was a holy woman, and her cause for canonization was opened, and she has begun the beginning of the process. So she's at the bottom of the rung. She is declared a servant of God, and let's hope that she will progress further than that, because she seemed to be a very good and holy woman. And I ask for your prayers, servant of God, Julia Greeley, on all of us in this course, that we would do well in this course and be blessed in our lives, especially those things that might be troubling us or disturbing us or causing us harm. Amen. La da da da, Julia Greeley. Okay, today we're going to start talking about who was Jesus Christ. And yes, as I said in the last class, I know I'm behind, so I'm trying to get ahead. And so I might not cover everything that's on the PowerPoint. I might, with my machete, cut away some stuff to try to get ahead as much as possible. Also, please remember that quiz number 2 is coming up on Friday. So we'll be doing that. I'll be doing that. I have to work on that. It's mostly done, but I have to work on it. Let's see, Mr. Kushner, are you here? Mr. Christian. Okay, Mr. Grimaldi is not here. Okay. Okie dokie. Who was Jesus? So we talked about some details about the ministry of Jesus, some of the things that Jesus taught. Who was he? How do we define him as a person? While the Gospels are extremely important, the four Holy Gospels, they were not written first. A lot of people assume that the Gospels were written first just because they... ooh, that's a lot of water, sir. Remember, the bathroom's down the hall. And okay. Anyways, people assume that because the four Holy Gospels come first in the New Testament that, they're just assumed that they're first. They're not first. They were not written first. They were written later. Actually, the earliest written documents that we have from Christianity, and actually from first century Judaism itself, because they were all Jews, are the letters of Paul, this man called Paul of Tarsus, Paul the Apostle. Mr. Grimaldi. Hello, sir. Paul's letters were written, scholars can date the letters through certain internal evidence, things that happened to him in Paul's life that we can establish archaeologically and historically. And so Paul's letters were written sometime around 50 to 65 AD. Circa, or did I put that in the PowerPoint? No, I did not. So I'll write it down. Circa 50 to 65 AD. So they really do give us some quite early insight into what Christians were thinking about Jesus of Nazareth. So even our earliest gospel, the Gospel of Mark, his letters date to before that by probably 10 years, by a decade. So how does Paul, so make sure my PowerPoint is correct, good it is. How does Paul present Jesus if we're looking for this early testimony about how Christians view Jesus very early on? And these were part of your reading, so I'm not going to reproduce the reading on the PowerPoint slide, but if you want to follow along from the letter of Philippians, you can in your Bible. My Bible out here. The letter to the Philippians that Paul almost certainly wrote. Where are you, my friend? Take my eyeglasses off here. No, Colossians. No, here's Philippians. Okay. And we are in chapter 2 of Philippians. Okay. And I had you or asked you to read this section from the letter to the Philippians, which scholars call the Christ hymn. Okay, this letter to the Philippians was almost certainly written by Paul, as we'll learn in the next lecture about the Bible, that scholars believe that some of the letters by Paul were not actually written by him, but were probably written by disciples of Paul in his name. Nevertheless, this letter probably was written by Paul himself, or at least dictated to a scribe who wrote it down for him. And scholars date the letter to the Philippians anywhere from between 54 and 58 AD. Okay, so anytime between 54 and 58. Still earlier than the Gospel of Mark, our earliest Gospel. And so Paul is indicating traditions about Jesus that predate the written Gospels that we'll eventually get. And in the Christ hymn in chapter 2, Paul seems to be quoting from an early Christian hymn, a song. So Christians were already writing songs about Jesus, that they were singing about him. So he seems to be quoting one of these early songs or hymns praising Jesus, which tells us that this hymn or this song about Jesus is even earlier than Paul's letter. So we can extrapolate from that this tradition, this hymn, probably came from the 40s AD. So quite close to the time of Jesus himself. And what does it tell us about Jesus and what they were thinking about Jesus? I'm just going to go through some of the verses of this song. I'm not going to read it all for you because hopefully you've already done that. But I do want to point out some things that are in the hymn that they tell us what Christians were believing about their experience of Jesus. And because it is so early, the 40s AD, you also have to remember that historically you are dealing with like the first generation of Christians, some of whom, perhaps many of whom, either knew Jesus personally or knew people who knew Jesus, like the apostles. So there's very important evidence about what they were thinking. Verse 6, and verse 6, which I said I wouldn't read, but I will read. The opening of the hymn that Paul quotes says, "Who Jesus, though he was in the form of God, the morphe of God, did not regard equality with God something to be grasped." The Greek word that I give it to you here on the PowerPoint of morphe simply means a shape or a form, okay, a figure. And we use it that way in English. If you say someone morphed into something else, you mean they changed figure or shape into something else. So we use this Greek word in English too. And notice that already very early, Christians are defining the morphe, the essential character of Jesus, his essential shape, as divine. He was in the morphe of God. So Jesus had a godlike, divine existence. Already very early on, Christians recognize in their experience of Jesus that he was not merely a human, although he was human, but he wasn't exactly like God either, interestingly enough. He was in the morphe of God. Now, this is an early stage, and Christians understand Jesus as divine and godlike, but he's not the Father. He's not God the Father. He's somehow distinct from God. He's a God in his own right some way. And this idea is going to have to develop, okay? They don't have it all figured out, but remember, it's based on their experience of who Jesus was. To say that Jesus did not grasp godhood, what does that mean? Well, we want to go to the Greek word, and the Greek word, it comes from this Greek verb, harpazo, which means to seize something, to steal like a thief, to snatch away from somebody. Okay? So you could almost say that Jesus did not take his godliness as something that he needed to hold close or that he was stealing from God. He has it by nature. It's natural to him. It wasn't something that he took from God or seized from God. It's also not something that he grasps and holds close like he would never give it away, because as the hymn progresses, it talks about Jesus who is in the morphe of God, but becoming the morphe of a human. He comes in human form. We see this in verses 6 through 7, where it talks about Jesus becoming enslaved. It talks about enslavement to the human condition. Jesus becomes human. Could also mention that there's already very early on, there's this belief that Jesus pre-existed his human life. He wasn't just born as a man from his mother, which that's the impression you could get from like the Gospels, because they never really, except for the Gospel of John, they don't talk about a pre-existence for Jesus. They assume that Jesus was just born in the human way like anybody else. But here we have in this tradition about Jesus, even before the Gospels, yes, Christians already were believing that Jesus had a pre-existence. He came from the supernatural realm before he was human. So he becomes enslaved to the human condition, which would be suffering, hunger, want, even death. The one who is like God now becomes like humans. He becomes in human form, homoioma. Okay, he resembles, he is similar to humans, which is also, it's an interesting Greek word and shows that there needs to be development in how Christians understood Jesus, because this word homoioma, which means resemblance, could be interpreted to mean that Jesus was not fully human. He just appeared to be human, but he was a divine being. And that seems to go against the evidence that they had of Jesus. No, Jesus truly seemed to be a human person. He had to eat, he had to sleep, he had emotions, his hair grew, he had to cut his hair probably, His fingernails grew. Jesus had to relieve himself just like any other human being every now and then, all these things. So all the evidence was that Jesus was human. He didn't just resemble a human, so this word will need to be further explained later on by the church. What does it mean by that? Because some early Christians will start to believe things like that. They'll believe that Jesus was so godlike that he wasn't human at all. He was just an illusion. He looked like a human, but he wasn't really human. And Christians will have to backtrack on that and say, well, wait a second. No, Jesus was truly a man. Well, then how does that work? Well, we'll learn that in a later class when we talk about the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Chalcedon and how the church has to think about that many centuries later. So the hymn presents Jesus' whole human existence as an act of selfless obedience to God. It gives us a kind of interpretation of what the life or the existence of Jesus meant. Who was he? He was the obedient servant of God. In verse 8, it says, Jesus humbled himself. He lowered himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on the cross. He was, as part of his mission, he was willing to accept the consequence of a human death for what he was doing. When we look at verses 9 and 11, the resurrection of Jesus is not specifically mentioned. It mentions his coming as a human. It mentions the death of the cross, but it does not specifically mention the resurrection. Although it's not specifically mentioned, it is kind of implied by the fact that God lifts Jesus up in this Greek word hupsoo. So it's not a misspelling. It is two letters here, omicron and omega. Hupsoo, to lift up or to elevate or exalt, as we would say in English from the Latin word. So God exalts Jesus or lifts him up. He raises Jesus to a higher level. What is this higher level? Well, the hymn kind of explains that by saying that Jesus, at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bend. So bending the knee in that culture, the culture that the culture of, say, Greece and Rome, was a sign of worship. You kind of lower yourself down to the earth. You make yourself lower than the person in front of you that you're bending the knee in front of. You bend one knee, but you might bend both knees, actually. And if the person were really important, then you would make a prostration, which is, you want to get as close to the earth as possible. I'll make it. Don't worry. If I don't get up again, call security. I might get up. It's the prostration, where you get right as close to the earth as possible, or if you want to really go the full Monty, the whole way, you do that. And this is actually how early Christians used to pray. They would prostrate themselves in the form of a cross, like that. So you're getting as close to the ground as possible. That's what, you're humbling yourself, which comes from the Latin word humus, which means the ground. Hence, you're getting close to the ground. So in the case of Jesus, Christians are humbling themselves. Well, I shouldn't say Christians, but everything is humbling itself, bending the knee before him as if he were a god, not just on earth, but even in the supernatural realms, Mr. Malone. In heaven and under the earth. So in heaven and in the underworld, where the dead are. So that's a very high, they're having a very high view of who this man Jesus is at a very early date in the history of Christianity. Jesus is given universal lordship. He is confessed as Lord and Savior of heaven, earth, and the netherworld. Which you might ask you, begs the question, well, what about God? Isn't God the Lord of all these things? Is Jesus now a competitor of God, or is he God? Well, he's not a competitor, because it explains in the hymn, in the final verse, that all these things happen to the glory of God the Father. And here we see a further specification. It's not just God, period. Christians are talking about God the Father, which again begs the question, if Jesus is the Son, is he now God the Son? So you have this kind of, there's a difference now being asserted between God, the one God, and now Jesus, who also seems to be on that level as well. Another hymn that I asked you to read was from the letter to the Colossians. Oh, and I wanted to show you where Philippi is, actually. Let me get my map here. My map. Let's see here, my maps. Here we go. Philippi was a town, or I guess maybe a city in Greece, ancient Greece. I don't know if it still exists today. I don't see it here on the modern map of Greece, but if you look at this map of Greece, the country Greece, Philippi was up in this northern region that I'm showing you, where it shows the city of Thessalonica, okay, to which Paul also wrote 2 letters. But Philippi is up here in the north. Colossae, I'm trying to remember where Colossae is. I forget where that is. Let's take a look. Away. See if it gives. I'm going to show the ruins of the city, but do they show a map? No, they don't show a map. Maybe someone shows a map. Was it in Asia Minor and not in Greece? Oh, it was in Asia Minor. Oh, okay. Oh, there we go. Interesting. Learn something new every day. Okay, so see the modern country of Turkey here off to the right, and in this region is where the city of Colossae was, and Paul writes a letter to a Christian community there. And in the context of his letter to that Christian community, we have quoted what seems to be another hymn, another Christian hymn, an early Christian hymn. I'm not going to go in depth into Colossae because I want to move on, as I said before. I will highlight 1 or 2 things from it. This is one of those letters that's disputed. It may be by Paul, this man Paul. It may not be. Scholars, many scholars reject that Paul wrote this letter, but some scholars do accept it. I accept it as written by Paul. I don't think the arguments against authorship are actually that strong, but nevertheless. So the letter could date anywhere from, well, Paul's dates, it could be anywhere from around 50 AD to 80. So it's still early in the history of Christianity, anytime between 50 to 80 AD. And obviously, if it is quoted, whoever wrote this letter to the Colossians, the church in Colossae in Turkey, if it's quoting this hymn, obviously the hymn pre-exists the letter, so we could date the hymn to sometime, again, maybe in the 40s, maybe in the 60s, okay, but it's certainly earlier than the letter that's quoting it. The letter continues this theme of Jesus being somehow connected to God, even being God himself. In verse 15, it talks about Jesus, as being created almost in the image of God. He is God's image, just as he is created in God's image. He is a katise, a creature. Again, this kind of early language where things are in process, things are in development. Christians are still trying to figure out their experience of Jesus. So, what it seems to say or sound like they're saying that Jesus was kind of like made into a God. Maybe he wasn't divine, but he was made divine by God the Father. Is that what they mean? We don't know because there's no explanation. It's the person who writes down this hymn is just quoting from it, so we don't know. It doesn't give an interpretation of it, so we don't know exactly. But to say that Jesus was created or made in the image of God is significant. Verse 15, Jesus is the image of the invisible God. So he's like God who cannot be seen, who's invisible because he's spiritual. Jesus is like the physical form of God. You can see God through Jesus. And then he says that Jesus is the firstborn of all creatures, the firstborn of all creation. Well, what does the writer mean by that? Again, this is something that Christians will have to later unpack and unload and think about, because there will be some Christians who will interpret statements like this in a very naturalistic way and will say that, yeah, Jesus is God, but he was created that way later by God. He wasn't originally a God. He was maybe a lesser God that was created by God. And the Christians, the church at the time, will have to react against that and say, well, no, that's not what we mean by this. And again, we'll talk about that in later classes when we talk about like the Council of Nicaea. There'll be controversy over statements like this. We also see the idea of pre-existence again. So this seems to have been an early topic, or at least an early issue with Jesus, because in verse 16 it talks about Jesus' role in the creation of the world. So again, pre-existing even the world and being involved in its creation. Let's see about that. Verse 19 is very interesting because it says, in quoting here, "For in Jesus all the fullness was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile all things, making peace through the blood of his cross, whether those on earth or those in heaven." This word, the fullness, is a Greek word, pleroma, which means fullness or perfection. And it means more than just the word fullness, okay? It's used to describe the fullness of the supernatural realm. That's how it was used kind of in Greek religion and philosophy. Everything that derives from God now resides in Jesus. He contains the fullness of all the supernatural reality. And it has taken up residence, when it says that it dwells in him, the word here is katiokeo, which is based on the word for house in Greek. So you could say take up residence or makes its home in Jesus now. So again, this is a very elevated statement about this man Jesus, that even the supernatural realm is completely found in this one person. It's found in this one person. So I want to say about that, I guess. So it gives us an early insight into what Christians were thinking. And I see that I have that definition there for preeminence. That would relate to the whole thing, that Jesus is preeminent over all the angels. That's another theme that goes throughout this hymn. And that, again, we see that Jesus' importance or significance transcends both the natural world and the supernatural, where it says in the final verse that through his cross, his dying on the cross, again, it doesn't specifically mention the resurrection, or even mention it at all, really, but it does mention the cross. Through Jesus' death on the cross, he brings peace to those on earth and in heaven. So his physical death on the cross has not just effects on the plane, the earthly plane, but on the supernatural plane as well, just like we saw in Philippians. Okay, I'll skip over preeminence. I won't ask you about that on the quiz as a definition. I'll just skip over it. Who was Jesus? Well, he's called Jesus the Christ, which, as I told you, is a translation of this Hebrew word, or this word that comes from Hebrew, actually Aramaic, the Messiah, this Jewish concept called a Messiah. And I might have given you the definition before, but I'll give it to you again. A Messiah was a descendant of King David who would come at the end of time to restore the kingdom of Israel, defeat Israel's enemies, and establish a reign of peace based on the faithful observance of God's law to Moses. Okay. Our word Messiah actually comes from the Aramaic language, which is related to Hebrew. It's very similar, very close to Hebrew, but somewhat different. It comes from the Aramaic word Meshicha, which means the same thing as the Hebrew word for Messiah, which is Mashiach, which literally means an anointed one. An anointed one. Also, as I've told you, but I'll tell you again, in Greek, this word Mashiach, this Hebrew word Mashiach, or Messiah as we call it, is literally translated by the word Christ, which means exactly the same thing. Krio, the verb krio in Greek means to anoint with oil, means exactly the same thing as Mashiach. So we get Christ, the anointed one. And in case you're not clear what anointing is, I gave you the definition of that. Whenever you apply oil to something, a person's body, a rock, whatever, if you pour oil on it, it's called anointing. Anointing. The idea of an anointed one, usually the king, is found throughout the Jewish scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament. And so in the Old Testament, we have only really 3 people identified as being anointed with oil or having oil rubbed on them or poured on them. And those would be priests, prophets, and kings. So these are people who are initiated into very special positions in Jewish society, mainly religious positions, part of the religion. Okay, obviously a priest, because the priests would offer sacrifice and worship to God in the temple, which would come later, but in their places where the Jews worshipped. The prophets were agents of God, who were bringing messages from God, and even the kings were seen as sons of God, were seen as God's children. And even though the king you might see as a political figure, the king had a role in the temple worship as well, would attend the worship of the temple and participate in it. So he was a religious figure as well. So in initiating these people into their position, part of the ceremony was to pour oil, usually on the head, and let it drip down over the body as a symbol. It was a symbol. You could say it's a symbol of God's spirit or God's grace or power, however you want to view it. But it was a symbol that the person was being initiated into this position. The idea that a king savior would come, a Messiah would come at the end of time, is not in the Old Testament per se. We don't really find this idea very clearly stated in the Jewish scriptures. The idea really becomes heavily accentuated or emphasized after the exile of the Jews, which occurs in the 6th century BC, the 500s BC. You have this man, King David, who is not the first king of the Jews, but eventually the Jews kind of organized themselves, their tribes organized together, their family groups organized together into a overarching government, a monarchy, where you had one man in charge who was the king. Okay, King David was not the first of the kings, but he's considered the greatest of the kings of Israel, of the Jews. And he, as you can see from the date he reigned, we think, around 1000 BC, so 3,000 years ago. And he reigned from 1020, I should say reigned, but, well, he flourished around 1000 BC. He was alive around 1000 BC. As far as we can date his kingdom, it dated the United Kingdom that was established around him. Remember, it didn't begin with him, but this United Kingdom existed from 1020 to 922 BC when it broke apart. And here you see a map of ancient Palestine with what we believe to be the boundaries. I mean, all of this is, kind of murky. I mean, you have to go according to details in the Bible where they give boundary locations for the kingdom. But this, is a generalized view of the extent of the influence of the kingdom of Israel, this united kingdom under David and under his son Solomon. So it extended mostly from the boundaries of the modern country of Israel. It goes up here into southern Lebanon, which is the southern portion of the country of Lebanon today, and parts of the southern portions of the modern country of Syria. Okay. And God makes a promise to King David. This is where we start getting, or at least Jews start seeing the origins of this idea of a Messiah. King David is the greatest of the kings, and King David has this wish. He wants to build a temple, a big house for God to live in the city of Jerusalem, where they can perform the sacrifices that they've been performing. And so this is on David's mind. He hasn't built the temple yet, but it's on his mind that he wants to construct one. And what happens is God appears to a prophet named Nathan, who is David's son, by coincidence. And God sends Nathan to his father, King David, with a prophecy, with a message. And the message basically is, David, you're not going to build me a house. I'm going to build you a house. And taking house in more of a metaphorical sense of the house of David, his family, the descendants of David. Okay, I'm going to build you a house that will last forever. Meaning that your descendants, the kings, the princes, your sons, the princes who will become king, their kingship will last for all ages. This is the promise that God makes through Nathan the prophet. This promise is stated in 3 places in the Jewish scriptures. The main place to look is in the 2nd book of Samuel. Samuel is, according to Jewish history, he's the beginning of the prophets. So we have 2 books related to him, but also these books contain the story of the beginning of the kingdom and King David specifically in all his doings. So if you go to the 2nd book of Samuel, chapter 7, this is where you find this prophecy given to him about God building him an eternal house. However, the story is repeated in the 1st book of Chronicles, which is essentially there are 2 books of Chronicles that come later in the Bible, and they're actually repetitive books. They repeat the story of the king of David and the kings of Israel. They repeat everything for the most part, from 1st and 2nd Samuel through the 2 books of Kings that follow it. Okay, so you have like 4 books that are repeated in these 2 books of Chronicles. Now, they're still very different. A lot of the same stories are repeated about David and whatnot. Not always. But a number of stories are repeated. So you can compare how the person who wrote Chronicles later tells the stories. But anyway, so you can find it in the 1st book of Chronicles, chapter 17. And it's pretty much the same story. There isn't really much of a difference between how the later author tells the story. But interestingly, we have another reference to this prophecy in the book of Psalms, it's a book of songs and hymns, Jewish hymns, some of which might have been used in temple worship, others might just have been used in Jewish worship generally. And there are a lot of psalms that are related to the king of Israel, okay? And this is one of them, Psalm 89. And scholars wonder whether Psalm 89 is actually the original version of the prophecy in poetic form, which was then transferred into story form in 2 Samuel. We'll see why that might be so in a moment. So in 2 Samuel, God, from the Jewish perspective, enters into his own personal covenant with David. Remember, a covenant is a binding agreement. God adopts David and his sons as his own. Not literally, okay, but metaphorically. The sons of David are now God's sons as well. And God promises David that his royal line will never end. And he also promises that he will protect David and his future descendants, the kings, from all his enemies. That's the promise. That's the expectation. That doesn't actually happen. Okay, which I'll get into in a moment. This is from Psalm 89. Would anyone like to read these verses from Psalm 89? Do me a solid, save my voice a little bit. I got you, Mr. Coons. You've done it before. Mr. Grimaldi, what do you think? Psalm 89? Yes? No? You got your... Well, it's right here, sir. I got you. No, hold on. Start. Oh, sorry, sir. Start here and go down like this, like that.
My servant of me, your dynasty stay forever, and establish your throne. Will be listening to your people what you said. I have set a leader. I have raised up a from the people. I have chosen David, my servant, with my holy. I have
Excellent, sir. Thank you. Okay. Clearly, you can see I'm not quoting from the whole psalm. I'm quoting from verses from the psalm. So this first section comes from verses 2 through 5, and then I quote later in the psalm from verses 20 to 21, and then it continues on. It's a longer psalm after that. Okay. But what can we notice here? What's interesting? Well, one thing to notice immediately is this word covenant, the word that I mentioned before, a binding agreement that God says, I make a covenant. And he uses the word covenant several times in the psalm, which makes it interesting and I guess maybe pushes some of the biblical scholars to thinking that this is the original form, is that if you read 2 Samuel, the version of 2 Samuel, it never mentions the word covenant. It never says, Nathan never says to David, I'm making a covenant with you and your sons. Ever. So where did Jews get this idea of a covenant between God, between God, between God, David, and his descendants? Well, it seems to be here from possibly the original oracle or prophecy in Psalm 89. Okay, because it specifically says, David is his chosen one, and God makes a covenant with him. I will make your dynasty stand forever. Okay, so this is an idea that is repeated later. I will, it won't, actually, it's not here. It's in another place I didn't put on PowerPoint. But this is repeated in another verse where, again, God repeats this, that, that the kingship, the kingdom of David and his descendants will go on for all days. All right? David is a leader. Again, he's the chosen one. And as God has chosen him, God shows his choice by pouring oil over him. Okay, and the Hebrew word here that's translated as "I have anointed him" is again, which comes from the root of the word Mashiach, the Hebrew word for anointing or pouring oil, and it's Mashachtiyu. I have anointed him. The verb here is mashach. The root word is mashach, which means to pour oil over someone or something. And so I have poured oil over him, mashach to you, Messiah. So I have, in a way, you could translate another way is I have Messiahed him. I have Christed him. Okay? And so that's also where you see the idea of a Messiah. Because again, it's not in 2 Samuel. There's no mention to God saying, I'm going to anoint you with oil. I'm going to Messiah you, make you like a Messiah. But it is mentioned in Psalm 89. Okay, so here we can see, I think, more clearly the origins of this idea. Okay, you too, sir. Oh, wait a second. Losing my mind. Sorry, I'm just thinking about something. Okie dokie. Moving on. Now, oh, wait a second. I did give you more verses. All right. Dr. Dunn, read your own PowerPoints. Sorry about that. I can move on because I made my point. I don't need. If you want to look at these verses, you can. But again, you can see. Well, actually, no. These are important because these will relate to Jesus as well. Verses 27 and 29. You are my Father, my God, the rock of my salvation. This is apparently David or the king talking to God. So here you see that the king is adopted. The David and his sons will be considered sons of God. saying to myself that will certainly relate to Jesus later on. But it'll also be a title for the King of Israel. He can also be called the Son of God. He will be I will make him the firstborn, most high over the kings of the earth. Now that's an interesting statement in and of itself, because this title of Most High was oftentimes reserved for God. The Jews would talk about God as the Most High of Israel, because they didn't usually they use the word God, but oftentimes Jews will speak around it out of respect for the name of God. So they'll use, like workaround statements, like calling God the Most High or the Lord, the Master, stuff like that. So the fact that this Davidic king, this Messiah, will also be called Most High is interesting. The Jewish writer at the time probably didn't mean it in the sense like the person's gonna be God himself. But it is interesting. What did God have in his mind when he was inspiring this? From a Christian perspective, you might think, what did God have in mind when he was inspiring the sacred author to write this? Because you can see in other examples, these are not the only examples, but if you look at Psalm 92, Psalm 47, Psalm 57, God is called the Most High, but here the Davidic king's being called that. Again, it mentions that God's covenant with David stands firm. In other verses, I will establish his dynasty forever. His throne will be as the days of the heavens. Okay, so heaven goes on forever. It's eternal. So his throne will go on forever. Even if his descendants forsake my teaching and do not follow my decrees, God will punish them, but he will not take his mercy from them. He will not betray his bond of faithfulness or violate the covenant. So it's an unconditional covenant, which is extraordinary, because typically, God would tie his blessings to the Jews based on the fact of their faithful following of his law. If they didn't follow his law, then he would punish them. He would curse them. But in this case, no. He might have to punish the Davidic king if his sons, for example, or even the Davidic king goes astray, but the covenant will not end. It will not be taken back. Okay? It will not be rejected. Now, as I told you this before, this did not happen, because we know from history. We know what happened later to the United Kingdom of Israel. It did not survive, actually. What happened was, and I'm giving you a very quick and brief crash course into Jewish history, at least as we know it from the Bible, because the Bible is accurate here. When David dies and his son Solomon takes over as king, and that's fine. The United Kingdom continues. But Solomon, was very oppressive to the northern Israelites, the northern tribes of Jews. Okay, they felt that they were misused, especially in the building of the temple. Solomon is the one who actually does build the temple. David doesn't. And he needs a workforce, and apparently he derives his workforce mainly from the northern Jews. And they feel that he misuses them and abuses them and oppresses them. Okay, fine. Solomon dies, and his son takes over, called Rehoboam. And because Solomon is gone, the tribes of northern Jews think that, well, maybe we can negotiate, Solomon was very harsh with us. Maybe we can talk to his son and get a better deal, and he'll, treat us better. And so, oops. Alrighty. Well, it's good that you remembered, sir. So representatives of the north. That's all right. No need to apologize. So representatives of the tribes of the north go down to Rehoboam, and they say, look, your father kind of treated us harshly. We're hoping that you'll treat us better. And Rehoboam's response is, that, maybe, whereas my father Solomon may have beaten your backs with rods, I will beat them with scorpions. Which was not the response they wanted to hear. So what happens is there's a revolt, and the northern tribes all separate from the southern part of the kingdom. So now you have a divided kingdom. You no longer have a united kingdom with Rehoboam. They establish their own king and their own kingdom, and they call themselves Israel. Maybe you can see it here on the map. This can get a little bit confusing, but they continue to call themselves Israel. They take the name of Israel, whereas the southern kingdom, which actually is two tribes, it's Judah and Benjamin, I believe. They call themselves, after the larger tribe Judah, they call themselves the kingdom of Judah, which is why we call them Jews. This is where the word Jew ultimately comes from, the descendants from the kingdom of Judah. So here we have the Davidic monarchy. It still exists in the kingdom of Judah because the kings of the kingdom of Judah all still come from the line of David. But there's a division now, okay? There's a problem. This happens around 930 BC, and the kingdom of Israel continues in existence until 721 BC. When an empire from the north called the Assyrians, the Assyrian Empire, the modern-day country of Syria, all right? They come down from the north, and they destroy the kingdom of Israel, and they disperse all the Israelites, the Jews, the Jewish descendants that are living there, who go God knows where. We have no idea where these people go. They're exiled. Some Jews still do exist in the previous kingdom of Israel, and they kind of, they're still there, but they're still kind of mixing with the foreigners who come in. And in fact, some of them might still be there. They're called Samaritans nowadays. They're a very small group, less than 1,000, actually less than 900, who claim the same faith for the most part as the Jews. They believe in the God of Israel. They have some of the scriptures from the Jewish Bible. They celebrate Passover, but they are genetically. They've done genetic studies, and they are genetically related to Jews, but their religious practices are still very, very different. They may be descendants of these people who remain. We don't know, but they may be. The kingdom of Judah is still in existence. Okay, so you could still, if you're a Jew, say, okay, the promise is still being paid off by God because, well, the kingdom is still there. Yes, the northern kingdom's been destroyed, but we still have Davidic kings ruling over the kingdom of Judah. Until you don't. And so, you have another empire which develops around the 7th century. In the 6th century BC, the Babylonians, who develop around modern-day Iraq, and they come over, well, they come north and they come down too, because this is all desert, but anyways, they come over, and in 587 BC, they destroy the kingdom of Judah. They depose the king, they end the Davidic monarchy, and exile a lot of the Jews from the kingdom of Judah to Babylon, to modern-day Iraq. Kingdom's destroyed. The temple is destroyed. The first temple is destroyed at this point, Solomon's temple, and the monarchy is completely dismantled. And so the Jews have to ask themselves this question, what do we do now? Because God had promised that his favor for David and his successors would not be removed, even if they were bad, even if they were unfaithful. God had promised clearly that David's line of successors will continue forever. So when the Jews who are taken into exile over here in modern-day Iraq, and they're there for a little less than 100 years, not as maybe, 70 years, I think they're in exile in total over in Babylon and Iraq. They have time to think about this, and they have to come up with an explanation, and their explanation is, well, God does not break his promises. So they believed and trusted in the promises of God. So they reasoned that a Davidic ruler must be coming in the future. God will send another Davidic ruler to make good on his promises, who will come later in the future or even at the end of time. And so now, in the time of this exile, this period of about 70 years in Iraq, the Jews who are living there come up with this idea of a Messiah. David is the anointed one. There is this anointed one coming in the future. So those are the origins of the idea. By the time we get to Jesus, about 500 years later, it's still kind of difficult to pin down what the idea of a Messiah was or would be, which might explain why Jesus hesitated so often to say he was the Messiah. Because the question was, what do you mean by the Messiah? Because there were various ideas, and I put three of them. There are three main ones that scholars identify, and I put them on the PowerPoint. The first one is that there would be a political Messiah, that people interpreted the promises, some Jews interpreted the promises to David literally as a warrior king, as a king like David himself, who would come and overthrow the enemies of Israel, and would literally reestablish the old united kingdom of Israel. There are Jews who still believe this today, Orthodox Jews, who are very strictly follow the law of Moses and believe everything in the law as divinely revealed, and certainly believe in the Messiah, still have this belief that if there's a future Messiah coming, it's not Jesus, wasn't Jesus, but the Orthodox Jews believe that there is a future Messiah coming who will establish the kingdom of Israel in Israel, where modern state of Israel is, will reestablish the temple and the sacrifices. And there were people who apparently held this view during the time of Jesus in the first century. So this was a nationalistic view of the Messiah and could be seen as subversive. Hence, when Pilate is interrogating Jesus, this seems to be what he's thinking about. He said, are you the king of the Jews? Are you a subversive? Are you trying to reestablish? Is that what you mean by Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth? That you're going to reestablish this kingdom and kick us Romans out of here? So this might have been enough for Jesus to have wanted to avoid its use. There was a spiritual view of the Messiah. You have in... Oh, and I didn't write it down here. I should have written it down and put it in the... oh well, doesn't matter. You have in the book of Deuteronomy, which is the fifth book, God bless you, fifth book of the Bible, Deuteronomy. Whoops. Which, remember, is Moses repeating the law to the Israelites before they enter the promised land. And in Deuteronomy, I want to say it's chapter 18, but I forget. Anyways, it is in the book of Deuteronomy. Moses talks about and prophesies, he foretells that God will send you a prophet like me. So someone in the future will come to you, Israelites, who will be like me, a prophet like I am. So there was this belief in a prophet like Moses. So there was a spiritual view of the Messiah, more of a prophetic figure who would call people back to the observance of God's law and the faithful following of God. And some communities, we have evidence from some communities from the first century believing that it was this Messiah would be more of a priest than a prophet. And they talk about a Christ of Aaron, or a Messiah of Aaron. Aaron was the first high priest of the Jews. He was anointed as the high priest of the Jewish people to offer the sacrifices. So there were some first century Jews who talked about it's more of a priest than a prophet who will come. It will bring people back to the following of the law, the Christ of Aaron, the high priest. And then there were those who were had an apocalyptic view of the Messiah, meaning the end of the world. That the Messiah would come to bring about the end of the world. And that would establish an eternal period of paradise. The kingdom of God would be a paradise on earth, okay? But only at the end of the world. It wouldn't necessarily be an actual kingdom of David like the political view wanted, but it would be the end of the world, apocalyptic. This word apocalyptic simply means revelation or uncovering in Greek. So uncovering the future in a manner of speaking. So it has that. It really should probably more properly be called eschatological. Because the word eschatos in Greek means last. So the end times, the last times. So it's another way to also describe this view of the Messiah, the future Messiah, an apocalyptic view, or more properly speaking, an eschatological view, the last times. And for a lot of Jews, they identified this eschatological or apocalyptic Messiah with a prophet named Elijah. I don't know why. I'd have to look it up and see why particularly. But he's one of the great prophets of the Jews, and he was one of the prophets during the exile in Babylon in modern-day Iraq. And so he is considered, he will come and bring about the end of the world. And he is not the Messiah, but he will bring the coming of the Messiah. He's like an announcer, a precursor to the Messiah coming. Or again, Orthodox Jews and a lot of Jews still believe this today. During the Passover ceremony they celebrate every year, there's an empty chair left for the prophet Elijah. At one point during the Passover ceremony, the Jews will open the door to let Elijah in on the pretext that they want to be ready in case he arrives to bring about the time of the Messianic age. So they do all sorts of symbolic stuff, and still a lot of Jews still believe in that. Jesus calls John the Baptist Elijah. Jesus specifically identifies John the Baptist, who he had a connection with, as by the way, guys, he was Elijah announcing my coming. So it's implicitly like, wink, wink, I am the Messiah, because Elijah has come already. So Jesus in some ways refers to this apocalyptic view in his own teachings. On the other hand, there actually is a fourth view, which is nada, Ms. Rarick. Nothing. There were some Jews who had no conception of the Messiah during the time of Jesus. They were not expecting a Messiah at all. It was not a reality for them. We can say one thing about the Messiah that's pretty definite and assured at the time of Jesus. There does not seem to be any evidence of a concept of a suffering, redemptive Messiah, a Messiah who would come and suffer for the sins of the people. And certainly there was no real concept of a Messiah who would be godlike or God. This was just not in the Jewish understanding of who God was and what the Messiah was supposed to be. So for all of these reasons, it might make sense that Jesus never comes out openly and clearly claims to be the Messiah, nor does he clearly reject the title when it is applied to him either. So, how does Jesus become the Christ? Who is Jesus? Well, he's Jesus Christ. Well, how does he become the Christ then? I mean, it's probably safe to say that Jesus did not claim messiahship because there were many different and competing views of what the Messiah might be. And that wasn't anything that Jesus was. He was something completely different. Jesus, whereas you have the political Messiah, where you have kind of a nationalistic view of Jesus, the Messiah, Jesus seems to have had a more extensive understanding, which included ministry to non-Jews, For the most part, Jesus saw his ministry as directed towards Jews, but he did also have interactions with people who were non-Jews. Also, Jesus does not seem to have seen himself as reestablishing an actual kingdom of David, where when he talks about the kingdom of God, it seems to be a universal, worldwide kingdom, which includes everybody. Yes. the suffering Messiah. I'll get to that in a second. Jesus does, however, although he does not frequently, almost never refers to himself specifically as the Christ or the Messiah of the Jews, he very often does describe himself as the Son of Man. So that gives us an idea of what was going on in Jesus' head. Son of Man. In fact, this is the title Jesus most often gives to himself. It occurs 81 times throughout all four of the Gospels, and it's in all four of the Gospels, so we have multiple attestation. So historically, we can say that this almost certainly goes back to the person of Jesus of Nazareth. This is how he described himself. But again, it's not entirely clear what that concept would have meant to Jews at the time of Jesus, or what it meant to Jesus himself, because he never says, here's the definition of what Son of Man means, guys, or gals as well. He just calls himself the Son of Man. But we do seem to have some evidence for what it might mean, and it does have a connection, possible connection, but a strong connection, it seems, to the idea of a Messiah. If we look in the Jewish scriptures to the book of Daniel, the book of Daniel it's about scholars call it an apocalyptic work. Again, I told you an apocalyptic is a revelation or an uncovering, books like Daniel have a lot of visions in them. Daniel receives a lot of visions from God, and these visions are kind of weird visions. It's like a dream where you have different things that are kind of stuck together, and then you have to interpret these symbols that the mind sticks together. So Daniel has these visions of beasts and monsters that are made up of, elements like iron and brass and stuff like that. And then you have to figure out, well, what are these referring to, what are these symbolic of, and all sorts of things. So it's called apocalyptic literature. It's a revelation, or you have to uncover the symbols. In Daniel chapter 7, he has a vision of these creatures, these monsters, which scholars believe actually just represent various kingdoms of the world that Daniel was familiar with. So we don't have to be afraid of them. But, one's a great lion with wings, another's a bear. I forget what this one is, the four-headed one. Obviously a bird, but I think it's an eagle with four heads. And then there's one that's just a monster. It's just not sure what kind of creature it is. But he sees these, these symbolic figures in his vision. And in the process of having the vision, there is the appearance of another being, a being like a son of man. One like a son of man. This is in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 to 14. I should read it. Or if someone wants to read it for me, that could be fine. If you can find it. Don't all go at once. Yes. Is it an eagle? Oh, it says it's a bird. It doesn't say it's an eagle. Mr. Kozlowski, you got it? Okay. Chapter 7, verse 13. Ooh, Ms. Rarick, you got tabs and everything. Hardcore. How are we doing, Mr. Kozlowski? Haven't gotten it yet? you want me to come and show you where it is, or will you find it? Yeah, chapter 7. Verse 13. Okay, that's fine. Thank you, sir. Okay. Now, this comes from this idea of a one like a son of man. In Aramaic, it's called Bar Anash, and that's literally what it is. Bar means son, and Anash is a human being, so son of a human being or son of man, which is generally a term in Aramaic for simply a human person, a human being. So it's one like a human being, you could translate it or interpret it. What does the author mean? Because it's a vision, so these are symbolic things, so we have to interpret them. Does he actually mean an individual? Some scholars would say that it's not so much an individual as the whole people of Israel together who will defeat the Israels arrayed against them. It's not clear. What is clear is that traditionally these verses were interpreted by Jewish teachers and rabbis and the early Christians as a reference to the person of the Messiah. Okay? And we have evidence for this. We have Jewish literature from just before or around the time of Jesus, just before the time of Jesus, like the book of Enoch. It's a book called the Book of Enoch, which is also filled with all sorts of visions and weird things that you have, and symbols that you have to interpret. And it was written sometime between 300 BC and up to 100 BC. And the Book of Enoch very clearly interprets the reference to the Son of Man as referring to the Messiah. So it gives us an idea of what some Jews understood this reference to mean. So we have some idea what some first century Jews might have been thinking. It's also interesting to point out that the text doesn't say that a son of man appears, but like a son of man, like a human being, which raises the question or begs the question of, is this not exactly a purely human figure? Is it something else? So some Jews interpret it to mean that it might be an angel, like the angel Michael, an angel named Michael, who's mentioned in some places. So this is the reference that Jesus frequently uses for himself. And we already looked at the trial of Jesus when we talked about why Jesus died. And we looked at the trial of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. And Jesus defines himself precisely in this way. You'll see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power, coming on the clouds of heaven. We just read this in Daniel 7. One like a Son of Man who will come on the clouds of heaven and will receive kingship. And the high priest seems to understand exactly what Jesus is saying because he calls him a blasphemer and says he deserves to die. Oh, okay, wait. Sorry about that. Why did my alarm go off? I apologize. It is going off. It's just not vibrating. I hate this phone. Even when I put it on vibrate, it still doesn't vibrate. Okay, good. So I'll stop here and we'll talk more about this on next Tuesday. So have a good weekend. God bless you all. You're welcome. You too, sir. Thank you. Hello, miss. Hello, sir. How are you? Hello, sir. Hello, sir. Okay, well, maybe I'll do that. Hello, ladies. You almost undercover. Teacher. Hello. Oh.